Perfect. Thanks very much. Yeah. So thanks very much for this invitation. This it's also part of the ongoing collaboration with Philippe and Christine, and also my work with Simran, who's also collaborating with Philippe on other things. So kind of many threads of collaboration running across this thing. Yeah. So sometimes, I mean, I feel that when we're talking about kind of platforms, we tend to end up with the big issues there. And I was just wondering whether what happens if you could try and take a case which is innocuous, perhaps even flippant, to try and perhaps bring out some issues which might then also talk to the other more sort of big issues kind of thing. And that, in a sense, is what we're trying to do here. Yeah, we'll do it in two parts. I'll talk through one of the parts, and then Simran will take it over and finish that. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, one of the clear focuses is that what would happen if we try and use the word platformization more often rather than the word platforms. Yeah. And elsewhere, I've called this, in terms of a methodology, the whole idea of verbing platforms. Yeah. Okay. And therefore, the focus there would be automatically towards a shift towards looking at processes there. Okay, and there are many of them which, in a sense, underlie what we see as platforms today, which, of course, I would look in terms of the building blocks of platforms. So there's a whole sort of long history of digitalization, which for me at many levels is a vehicle for formalization of the way in which the economy unfolds. There is also the kind of process of massification here, not only that of expansion, but also the whole force of enclosure here, which often tends to get left out when we have debates on massification here. And then, of course, there is this tremendous mediatization of sociability and of transactions as well. Yeah. And I'll talk more about that as we go in. And of course, finally, the process of datafication and the kind of regimes of legibility they in turn spawn, which of course then also shapes the way in which formalization tends to unfold there. In a recent book, we sort of talked about this idea of a kind of a markets approach towards platformization, yeah, okay, as opposed to the more affordances-based approach, which is relatively more common, and those, of course, focusing on usage. Yeah, the idea, of course, here is to try and look at platformization as a way in which the market system is being reformulated. Yeah, okay. So the emphasis, therefore, is not on the processes of or the existence of new commodities, but the kind of reformulation of new market systems. Yeah, within which, of course, we see this tremendous interdependencies between different types and kinds of marketplaces. Yeah. And of course, these marketplaces, not only do they aggregate publics, but they derive value from overlapping kind of market processes. But of course, beyond overlapping, there is this element of simultaneity in it. Yeah. And therefore, we see multiple products in simultaneous transactions, which are happening across platforms. Yeah. And profits, therefore, are generated not only through transactions, but also during the course of each transaction. Yeah. And therefore, there is arguments about talking about a transaction economy when we talk about platforms. Yeah. And of course, lastly, the kind of markets approach also tends to make us look at the way in which the social is getting reformulated. Yeah. And this, in a sense, is also evoked in the keynote. Yeah, that the domain of the social gets mined, abstracted, and then marketized. Yeah. You know, so with this kind of framework, what happens if we try and look at the experience of platformization in India? In the same book, we actually sort of proposed a typology of platforms to perhaps try and organize the way in which this kind of typical long tail industry has emerged. And it's a kind of four-way typology. One, of course, clearly is the extension of the audiovisual economy and what we recognize as media platforms, which, of course, most of us would be talking about today and tomorrow. But then we also have the expansion of the mediated economy in what we would call the typology of commodity platforms. Yeah. Okay, so food delivery, e-commerce, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Then, of course, we have the exchange platforms, which are the focus here, where essentially the idea is the enclosure of social economies. Yeah. And these social economies could be around marriages and dating, religion, exchange between peer groups, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And of course, largely we have what are called governance platforms, yeah, which is essentially the deepening of the state. And I've sort of called this elsewhere also the platformization of the state itself. Yeah. Okay. So you, at one level, we have a kind of state involved or complicit in exercise of platformization, but we then also have the platformization of the state itself. Yeah. The focus today, of course, as clear would be from the title, is on exchange platforms, more particularly a subtype of exchange platforms, which are we call matchmaking platforms. Yeah. Okay. So therefore, the social economy around marriages, the social economy or around dating, these perhaps together constitute one basket where matchmaking, the whole exercise of matchmaking at different levels, is undergoing a certain kind of platformization. I think matchmaking platforms are interesting because at one level they represent the mechanization of social capital. Yeah. Okay, and that's pretty fundamental to all exchange platforms, that social capital is constantly getting mechanized. Yeah. But they of course also have features along with other platforms about being time independent, content abundant, curated, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And of course, like most other platforms, they are also sustained by the audience commodity. Yeah. And in a sense, one of the quotes reproduced here by our respondent sort of talks about this whole idea of the relationship between algorithm and the enhancing of chance. Yeah. Okay, so chance, not chance as proposed by the algorithm. Yeah. But of course, matchmaking platform at a more deeper level are, for me, a very explicit illustration of the reconfiguration of social economies. Yeah. So there is the formalization of offline social practices. There is the massification of products and of markets. There is the high mediatization of exchange. We also see the domestication of industrial strategies. And of course, important to all forms of social exchange is the reformulation of trust. And this is something, of course, one will try and explain through various illustrations as we go through. Yeah. The other interesting thing about matchmaking platforms is that the way they're located, if you just have a quick thumbprint of the entire platform market in India. So they're not, in a sense, as marginal as one might imagine. Yeah. You know, not only across kind of all the entire platform market, but also within the subtype of exchange platforms. Matchmaking platforms are pretty much in the game, in a sense. Yeah. To the whole idea of platformization itself. And there again, what the whole emphasis on platformization, of understanding the whole thing as a process, is the kind of the deep history of kind of matchmaking. Yeah. And here, of course, one goes back to the mid sort of 20th century, where for the first time in newspapers, we see what are called matrimonials. Yeah. Matrimonials are essentially advertisements for marriages. Yeah. Okay. And if you look at them closely, and they still continue, if you look at them closely, they have typically what we today would call filters, in a sense, preferences in terms of, you know, of alliances being made around those kind of matches. So caste, complexion, religion, region, these are sort of very clear preferences spelled out in the matrimonials. Of course, the more recent one also spells out a preference towards whether the person has got vaccinated against COVID or not. Yeah. So this, in a sense, a kind of a dynamic process of how preferences get evolved, and then get locked in to the idea of matrimonials. Yeah. But then, of course, by the mid-90s, we saw the digitization of this entire process with the emergence of the first kind of websites of matrimonials. Yeah. And this, in a sense, has been sort of talked in terms of the mechanization of kin work, in a sense, work which is done by the extended family, the peers, that in a sense is taken over by these websites. Yeah. But then, of course, there are subsequent phases of digitization where other digital technologies also get leveraged in the process of this mechanization of the kin work. Yeah. Okay. And that, in a sense, is also quite clear from what our respondents talked about. Yeah. There is, of course, tremendous a sense of kind of media richness in this whole experience of matrimonial platforms. not just very rudimentary photo albums as they were there in earlier years, but sort of the incorporation of things like video chat, messaging, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So in a sense, I mean, some of these adverts for matchmaking platforms look very much like adverts for OTT platforms. You know, people in a family situation are kind of consuming a certain kind of product there. There are, of course, multiple levels of formalization, which has also happened as the matrimonials get platformized here. And the filters that we talked about earlier in terms of social preferences, they tend to get locked in there. And of course, more and more of these filters are added, but there are no gray areas, as there are no gray areas in a drop-down menu, for example, in any of the programs that we use here. There's also a formalization in terms of embedded values in society, tend to, in a sense, get incorporated in these platforms. So, for example, a birth chart, which is an important kind of a knowledge on which marriages traditionally were kind of organized, that, in a sense, now gets prompted by the machine. Yeah. So the whole idea of prompting a match is incomplete until the birth chart also prompts that. Yeah. And again, this is something which is coming out from one of the respondents. And of course, you have basic ideas of formalization where things like login gets restricted to certain kind of mechanisms, phone or email, and so on and so forth. In terms of massification, there are at least kind of two levels where you can see the massification of matrimonials through their platformization in terms of products there. So there, of course, the attempt to try and enclose newer kind of product niches. So it's not just, you know, traditional kind of marriages, but also marriages between divorcees, marriages between certain kinds of professional communities, and not just kinship communities. Okay, and then of course there's a whole massification in terms of geography as well. Yeah, and where of course the diaspora, in a sense, is a very important part of this kind of product market, in a sense. Yeah. But there is also massification in terms of markets. Yeah. In this sense, aggregation of different kind of activities. Yeah. So, for instance, matrimonial platforms have undergone vertical integration by commencing offline services to organize weddings and so on and so forth. Yeah. So it's not just the whole idea of kind of matchmaking, but also delivering, in a sense, or operationalize that idea of matchmaking which is taking place. And of course, the second part, which is interesting, because it leads to what Simran will talk about, is the horizontal expansion. Yeah. In a sense, what happens when one type or subtype of matchmaking platform, marriage sites, acquires dating apps. Yeah. Is that a kind of example of horizontal expansion of within, I beg your pardon, within the market of matchmaking? Yeah. Simran will take over here.
All right, is this visible? All right, so I'll just continue. So we see similar elements of reformulation reproduced in the economy of dating platforms or the casual relationship platforms in India. First, we see the industrial practices of or strategies of localization by international applications. This allows them to expand and sustain a significant reach in India, furthering the embeddedness into the market. This includes domesticating efforts to Indian social values, which are reflected in built-in preferences unique to the local socio-cultural dynamics in India, such as these questions on public display of affection or questions on whether women should be working after marriage on the dating app called OkCupid. Similarly, there are these built-in preferences concerning the user's political values or response to specific situations of political conflict in the country, as reflected in this question about whether one would like to match with someone of opposing views on Citizenship Amendment Bill in India. So these preferences are dynamic in nature as opposed to the fixed preferences of caste, height, religion present on matrimonials. They're also incrementally attuned or locked in to the given socio-political developments, allowing the users to respond and their responses to be fed in over time and the data to be continually extracted from one user. And both allow for granular preferences to be recognized, datafied, and extrapolated. Now we come to the Indian dating platforms, where which were early entries and created the market and garner quite a high reach in the market. They've reformulated the practices of matchmaking by doing away with explicit filters of caste or skin complexion, like in the early matchmaking industry, but they incorporate personalized filters or class filters rooted in the discursive aspects of urbanity or modernity. This points to preferences such as drinking and smoking habits of a person, or whether they are vaccinated, or the possibility of setting a hyperlocational boundary for matchmaking, which themselves are determined by the class orderings of the city. Like matrimonials, dating apps too indulge in niche creation and practices of enclosure through deep massification of products. So first we see differentiating and classifying queer identity as a product accessible through digital platforms. Then we see apps enclosing the niche demand for relationships outside of marriage, which also show a wide reach in India. And finally, we come to global apps addressing the diasporic population, which Professor Vibodh also spoke of, which have, these apps are populated with Indian cultural references, but they also mirror the matrimonial filters of caste and community. And they also capture this long-standing demand from the Indian diaspora for women with Indian specificities or upbringing. Therefore, only Indian women and not men can access these apps. The dating apps don't display the similar form of consolidation as the matrimonials, but they do show multiplicity of players in a dispersed market, but they do point to a highly integrated platform ecosystem. This leads us to the question of whether these forms of matchmaking platforms are substitutable one for another, or they serve different gratifications. The user perception that we found through our respondents was these services point to non-substitutability. The evidence shows the interoperability of the user across dating and matrimonial platforms in search for similar services. However, the discursive differences are laid out more evidently and leads to the user leaving or joining another app. On the other hand, the industrial strategy of enclosure aims to capture this fluid category between the two, with matrimonial sites integrating dating services into their expansive database of serious relationship seekers. So this frivolous or flippant case, as we call that, of matchmaking platforms brings us to the big policy issues which are otherwise veiled by the incremental reformulation of social economies. The first one that we come to is trust. So the trust building protocols of these apps put the user as the subject of trust making with the machine, which is often in exchange for premium services, which also expands this idea of trust as a transactional resource in the platform ecosystem. The idea of trust, or the mechanisms used to build trust, one of them are selfie verification. Through various types of photographs and video calls, users indulge in trust making with a facial recognition system, or the company or the dating application. Then we come to the cross-platform verification, or the linking of social media profiles, in which trust is leveraged upon seamless transfer of data of personal information from one platform to another. And finally, with providing proof of self with personal identification documents such as voter card, Aadhaar card, or driving license, which has been studied in the case of the domestic app Truly Madly. But also in some cases such as matrimonial, this extends to social security numbers for international users. So the regulatory concerns that these trust building protocols highlight is when the data is mandated to be retained and verified by the state as per law. This surrounds the questions of feasibility and intention of maintaining this information, but also the requirement of deriving state legitimacy for certain types of exchange on platforms, and therefore builds the question of how such a mass metadata is retained, processed, to what end, by who. And this takes us to the big issue of data. In this, we tabulate this landscape showing the reach, access, and affordances of dating platforms in India. We see that the set login options for acquiring access include phone, email, the operating system login or the device login, and Facebook, which seems to be present in all of them as a form of entryway. And when it's not available as a part of login, it's available as a cross-platform feature. These cross-platform features also are available across different types of platforms, across the different typologies that we discussed, which is exchange platforms, commodity platforms, media, and also in the cases that we will show further in governance platforms. And these are put in place to personalize and enhance the online matchmaking experience of the user. This table also shows the thin jurisdictions of platforms existing in India, and maybe in the case of matrimonials, it will also reflect the Indian sites having operations abroad. But such jurisdictional issues heighten the issues of conflict resolution, but also impede concerns of data sovereignty of the users, which we'll discuss further. So these issues of data are actualized by certain mechanisms of login options, which are set in place to establish the legibility of the user, which also suggests an enclosing practice with limited and fixed entry pathways. And they allow for unguarded transfer of data across platforms. Especially standing out is the presence of login through Facebook, which highlights the dependence on Facebook to certify a certain form of online social identity, but also how this information shared from Facebook is not restricted to the public information on Facebook. On the other hand, this access for Facebook to dating apps possibly fuels its own venture into dating. And in some cases, we see that this affordances has been incrementally available to optimize matchmaking experience. So here the concerns of data sharing can be highlighted, as we do see, by the limited login options. But the complexities of data sovereignty are enhanced by the lack of control users have in processing the processing of this intimate data, again, which are impeded by the jurisdictions, the international jurisdictions of these intermediaries. Then we come to the strategies of cross-platform features, which we discussed before, but it includes the related benefits such as economic exchange or premium services and dating insights, which open avenues for dating platforms to ensure user sticking and also result in micro-targeting. This has been studied elsewhere for part-dependent platforms integrating within the urban settings. But with this nature of integrations between variegated platforms, it highlights the generation of interdependencies through data aggregation and overlap. And these kinds of interdependencies throw concern of opacity in heterogeneous data collected, processed, and simultaneously made available to external stakeholders. Okay, so therefore, through this case of matchmaking and matchmaking as exchange platforms, we support that the methodology of verbing platforms has certain gains, which is through an effort to engage with historicity and evolutions of structures and institutions. Novelty of these platform markets can be mapped and studied. Identifying the interests external to the platforms themselves substantiate their embeddedness within the social settings, moving away from their previously imagined disrupting tendencies. And also recognizing their industrial practices of blending the particular and universal through domestication, as we saw, helps us put shape to their amorphous reach. So such an approach helps in pinpointing policy challenges and concerns which we touched upon today, and these include the big challenges of trust building, platform dependencies, and data sovereignty. Thank you.